Did you know that Samsung's major client is none other than its biggest competitor, Apple itself? Yeah, you heard that right. The iPhone's A4 chip, flash memory, RAM, and even the display are all supplied by Samsung. In fact, in 2019, Apple paid nearly $700 million just to buy technical equipment from Samsung. But does this mean that Samsung is the biggest company and not Apple? Maybe not. Or maybe yes. Because if we talk about the 2020 World Economic Forum, Samsung was in 5th position while iPhone took the #1 spot. And that's not all. Apple sold a whopping 90.1 million phones in 2020, where Samsung could only sell 73.9 million. But despite selling so many products, why is Apple only contributing 1% in American GDP, whereas 17% of South Korea's GDP is contributed by Samsung alone? And despite all this, the most crazed in the market is the iPhones. But yes, we can't deny that every third person in the market is using Samsung. And this is what makes me think. Who is Samsung or Apple? Is the quality upgrade from the reasonable phones of Samsung? Well, to know the answers to all these questions, let's start today's video titled Samsung versus Apple, which is bigger, and who is the best? Now, whether it's about enmity or marriage, we first of all find out their horoscope, right? Before we start talking about these two enemies, let's find out their horoscope, which is their history. And as far as I know from Apple and Steve Jobs' horoscope, you all must already be familiar with it, right? After all, who doesn't know that they started writing Apple's story at the age of 21? And how Steve launched the PC in 1998, then the iPod in 2001, the iTunes Music Store in 2003, and in 2007 the iPhone, and finally the iPad in 2010. Since then, Apple's products have been ruling the hearts of consumers and the electronic market. Now, if we talk about Samsung, the story of Samsung and Lee Byung-chul is a bit different. In the beginning, Samsung was a noodle shop. Then, they started selling dried foods. The company later moved into telecommunications, and as soon as they entered this market, they launched both Android smartphones and Android tablets in 2010. That's why we can say the iPhone has won the market, but Samsung was already winning the trust of the people. So friends, now let's talk about their capabilities. And when it comes to capabilities, then Forbes list and their stats, according to the world's biggest companies, Apple is in the 6th spot with a market value of $252 billion, and by May 2021, Apple made sales of $292 billion, from which they earned a profit of approximately $57 billion. On the other hand, Samsung is ranked 11th among the world's biggest companies with a market value of $510.5 billion. If we talk about May 2021, Samsung made sales of approximately $175 billion and earned a profit of around $20 billion from that. Now, if you're feeling confused by the Forbes comparison, let's move on to a more straightforward comparison. Now, if we talk about normal comparisons outside of the Forbes list, according to the Indian smartphone market share, Samsung is soaring high with 21.38% market share, while Apple is struggling on the ground with only 2.86%. Not only in market share, but Samsung's workforce is also many times larger than Apple's. Samsung has around 287,439 employees, while Apple has only 147,000 employees. But yes, there is one area where Apple is putting Samsung in the shade. Do you want to know what that is? The answer is sales. In the year 2020, Apple sold 90.1 million phones, while despite Samsung's efforts, they were only able to sell 73.9 million phones. And I'm talking about worldwide sales here, so clearly, Apple isn't as successful in India. And in Europe, Samsung is also losing in sales. But now, the question arises, if Apple is selling so many phones and its profits are in the billions, why is it still only contributing 1% to the American GDP? Because when it comes to Samsung, can you imagine this? Samsung alone contributes 17% to South Korea's GDP. How is Samsung contributing more to GDP than Apple? So friends, the reason behind this is that Apple is doing certain things to avoid paying taxes. For instance, in 2018, Apple earned enough that it could have easily paid $78.6 billion in taxes. But despite being such a huge tech giant, it didn't follow its ethics and, with great cleverness, moved the money overseas. And this is just one example of those countless tax avoidance schemes. The company made a profit of $74 billion and didn't pay anything in taxes. Now you might ask, if all of this is known, why isn't the US government doing anything about it? Or are they turning a blind eye? Well, friends, the answer is that they are ignoring it because there is a deal between Apple and the government. The government gets what it wants, and Apple gets what it wants. It's a kind of fair deal. And friends, why does Samsung earn less than Apple? We have to go back in time to understand that. In 2016, Apple introduced 3 new phones to the market, while Samsung launched 30. But according to Business Insider, Apple still earned double the profit of Samsung. And why? Apple's brand value is extremely high, and the craze for iPhones is even higher, so the company sets a high profit margin. You've probably heard that Apple's hardware is often outdated and inexpensive to make, but they still charge a premium for it. Samsung, on the other hand, has to keep its profit margin low because it not only competes with Apple, but also with other Android brands like Xiaomi, Vivo. If they don't, companies like Xiaomi or OnePlus could take over. In the next video, we'll discuss Apple versus Xiaomi. But for now, this was a conversation about competition and profit margins. Now, let's see how Samsung contributes so much to GDP. Well, the answer is that Samsung doesn't only sell phones, but operates in many sectors. And as I mentioned in the intro, Samsung's major client is Apple itself. Apple buys a lot of OLED screens, RAM, A4 chips, flash memory, and other internal components from Samsung. So, statistically, Apple is a bigger company because it sells more phones, ranks higher according to economic forums, and earns more revenue. But comparatively, Samsung contributes more to GDP revenue than Apple. 2029, Samsung has a larger workforce than Apple. So does this mean Samsung deserves the title of the bigger company, or should Apple get it? Well, it's hard to say who is truly bigger, even with all this data. So let's focus on another question first. Who is the best? I mean, who is the best, Apple or Samsung? Because if you know who is the best, you might automatically know who is bigger, right? But maybe it will be just as difficult to answer who is the best. It all comes down to the definition of best. The needs and preferences of users vary from person to person. Maybe I have a need that Android doesn't fulfill, so I think the iPhone is the best. But if I talk about my father, he might find it hard to use an iPhone because he has never used one before. So, for him, Samsung would be the best. So how can we objectively decide who is the best? Well, we can judge them based on certain factors, like number 1, supply chain integration. Apple sources most of its internal hardware from other companies and only assembles those parts in-house. As we just saw, Apple relies on many components from Samsung, but Samsung manufactures most of its own hardware. We can say that Samsung is a self-reliant company, producing all the essential parts for its devices. However, friends, despite Samsung's self-reliance, it may not yet be on par with Apple in terms of being a phone company. Why and how? First, let's clarify the concept of native services and app ecosystems. Native services and app ecosystems refer to the process of relying on another company for applications and services. For example, if you observe closely, you'll notice that Samsung relies heavily on Google for its services and applications. Meanwhile, Apple has its own app store and provides many services independently. So in this category, Apple takes the win. Number 3, developer ecosystem. If we talk about the developer ecosystem, Samsung doesn't have one of its own in the same way Apple does. But this is only true until we consider specific services. Samsung does have a developer ecosystem for some of its products, like the Tizen OS used in their Galaxy smartwatches and smart TVs. However, for other aspects, it relies on Google, since Google owns the Android operating system. On the other hand, Apple has its own independent developer ecosystem, which is constantly evolving with new apps. This makes Apple the clear winner in this category as well. Number 4, platform openness and transparency. Now, friends, it's common knowledge that when we talk about platform openness and transparency, Apple is far behind Samsung. The two platforms are as different as night and day. iOS is a proprietary operating system, while Android is built on open source code. For instance, If you want to listen to music on an Apple device, whether it's an iPhone or an iPad, you often have to buy songs from iTunes. Alternatively, you can download songs on a MacBook, transfer them to iTunes, and then finally sync them to your phone. On Android, you can simply download music directly from Google and listen to it right away. Even kids can do that with ease. In this case, convenience is the winner, and that's why Samsung comes out on top. If you're looking for a good camera or top-notch security, some people might say Apple is the best. But others argue that Android is superior because it's easier to use and offers more storage. And most importantly, Samsung is more affordable, meaning it won't burn a hole in your wallet. So friends, to wrap it up, we can say that Apple is the best when it comes to sales quality, security, software features, and overall user experience. In fact, if we took a poll, I think most people would vote for Apple, right? But we can't ignore that Samsung is a much larger company in terms of its reach. It's not just dominating the electronics market, but also operates in industries like insurance, shipping, construction, and about 80 other sectors. This conclusion isn't just mine. It's backed by the market and stats. If you take a closer look, you'll see all the evidence. So friends, now I want to know what you think. Which company is the biggest? Apple or Samsung? If you're curious about how Apple became the most valuable company in the world and want to dive into the full story, click here to watch the complete video.